So I think it's pretty remarkable that 5 years ago we would say we had no treatment for Marfan syndrome and no treatment for Loeys-Dietz syndrome. At the current time, we are testing 9 different treatments in our mouse models. And we're really excited about medications that block ERK. And I'm pleased to tell you that we've now been able to test them. Here's one of them that's called UO126. And we can see that it dramatically reduces the rate of aortic growth in our Marfan mice. Now, UO126 is an experimental drug. It would be 10 years before we could bring this to people. But we've now partnered with a drug company that has another ERK blocking agent that's already in clinical trials in people. And this completely turns off the growth of the aorta. You can see that the aorta is simply not growing at all compared to Marfan mice that were untreated. So we think it's another exciting member of our arsenal to consider in treating people with either Marfan syndrome or Loeys-Dietz syndrome. All right, so that's the Marfan background. Now, all of you know about the features of Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Many of them are identical to Marfan syndrome, like curvature of the spine, chest wall deformity, long fingers, and aortic root aneurysm. But there are also many findings that you don't see in Marfan syndrome, such as widely spaced eyes, a cleft palate or a bifid uvula, premature fusion of the skull. Some individuals have what's called club foot deformity at birth. People can have other forms of structural heart problems, although not many people have this issue. We all know about arterial tortuosity, that aneurysms can occur throughout the circulation, not only at the root of the aorta, but also at other sites. And that compared to Marfan syndrome, these aneurysms tend to tear at younger ages and smaller dimensions. We now have good information on about 200 families with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. There are other investigators around the world that we're partnering with that are also collecting information. So we're I think, learning quite a bit. Now, based upon what we had learned about Marfan syndrome, we bet that Loeys-Dietz syndrome would also be related to TGF-beta. And in fact, the very first 2 genes that we sequenced encode the receptor that sits on the cell surface for TGF-beta. And indeed, that's where people with Loeys-Dietz syndrome have their mutations. We don't fully understand the mechanism yet, but these mutations in the genes cause very high levels of TGF-beta activity in Loeys-Dietz syndrome, just like we see in Marfan syndrome. So at this point, I told you I don't have proof, but it makes sense to try losartan in people with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. That's been the message in the past. We wondered whether our new candidate, ERK, might also play a role in Loeys-Dietz syndrome. And we've now been able to test this because we have now made Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice. We have 3 different strains of mice that have a mutation that we know causes Loeys-Dietz syndrome in people. And we can see that in normal mice, ERK levels are low. In one of our Loeys-Dietz syndrome mouse lines, it's high. Another normal set of normal mice low, another different type of Loeys-Dietz syndrome mouse, and ERK is high. So it's telling us we're on the same path as we were in Marfan syndrome. Now here's some images from the Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice. You can see that they have a very elongated arch of the aorta compared to the aortic arch in a wild-type mouse without Loeys-Dietz syndrome. You can see that the neck vessels are kind of windy or tortuous. The coronary arteries that supply blood to the heart muscle are straight in the mouse without Loeys-Dietz syndrome, and again are very windy and tortuous, as are the blood vessels that are bringing blood to the chest wall. Now, I got to tell you that initially I was a little worried. What I worried about is that all these blood vessel problems in Loeys-Dietz syndrome might be declared during embryonic growth, that it would be too late after birth to make a difference. But what I'm pleased to tell you now is that that's not true. If we follow these Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice over time after birth, we see the tortuosity is getting much worse, and we see that aneurysms are forming after birth. So this tells us there is a window of opportunity after birth to make a difference. Now, can we make a difference? And what we've now done is done a trial of losartan in Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice. So here I'm showing you at the very beginning of the trial, before any mouse has received any drug. This is aortic size in a wild type or mice without Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Here are the Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice that we had randomized to not receive drug, and here's the ones that we decided we would treat. And importantly, at the beginning of the trial, the mice that we were not going to treat and the mice that we were going to treat had the same size aorta. That's what we'd want going into the trial. After 12 weeks, you can see that the Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice that did not receive treatment now have much bigger aortas than the Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice that did receive treatment. And this relates to the rate of growth. Here's the rate of growth of the aorta in untreated Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice. Here's the rate of growth of the aorta in treated Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice. This rate of growth is actually below the rate of a normal mouse. So really the brakes have been put on. This aorta is no longer growing, and therefore when we look later, it's smaller than in the mice that did not receive treatment. This is exactly what we hoped for. This is what I hypothesized when we decided to treat people with losartan, but I can now tell you that it's true. We find that in Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice, there is high activation of TGF-beta, and that losartan is bringing that level of activation back down. We can see that ERK, the molecule that we really think is at the center of things, is very high in Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice that are not treated, and it's brought fully down to normal by treatment with losartan, that we're turning off this bad pathway. So I want to end by acknowledging the tremendous number of young people that I have that are actually doing this work, that give me the privilege of presenting their work to you. But these are all the people in my lab who have contributed to what I've shown you. There are many very prominent people. I don't have time to go through everyone, but as you know, Bart Loeys was a very important member of my lab when we first recognized and described Loeys-Dietz syndrome. David Locke has made the Loeys-Dietz syndrome mice. You're going to hear about, you see a lot of names here that you're going to hear from later. I'd like to take the opportunity to answer any questions that you may have, but I want to sum up in case people got lost in all the molecule names. This is exactly what I hoped I'd be able to tell you this day, 5 years after recognizing Loeys-Dietz syndrome. I think that this is really as good as I could have hoped, and really contributes to the continuing view that the future is very bright for people with Loeys-Dietz syndrome. Thank you for your attention again. I'd be happy to answer questions.